Before we used to just talk about Alzheimer's disease as the scientific problem, but now we're able to talk about it as a clinical problem and how we're going to intervene and improve patients' lives. So this is so exciting.
Welcome to Let's Talk Alzheimer's, your place to go for the most up-to-date conversations with world-renowned research scientists and doctors. And now, Let's Talk Alzheimer's with your host, Nancy Keach.
Welcome to Let's Talk Alzheimer's, a podcast from BrightFocus Foundation's Alzheimer's Disease Research Program. Today's episode focuses on two medications that have garnered enormous attention in the Alzheimer's community, Leqembi and Kisunla, the first FDA-approved treatments shown to slow the progression of Alzheimer's disease. Many researchers and clinicians see this as a watershed moment in Alzheimer's care, where the disease may finally be treatable in a meaningful, disease-modifying way. But what do these drugs actually do? Who are they meant for? And what are the associated risks? You're about to hear my conversation with Dr. Armen Moughamian, a cognitive neurologist and the medical director of the Ray Dolby Brain Health Center, part of the California Pacific Medical Center and Sutter Health in San Francisco, California. Dr. Moughamian explains the science behind these new therapies, who's eligible for them, what patients and families should realistically expect from treatment, and why early diagnosis matters more than ever. Here's our conversation. Welcome, Dr. Moughamian.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm excited to have this conversation. I would like to say, just because this has been sponsored by pharma companies and for full disclosure for myself, I have done consulting and done clinical trials with some of these pharmaceutical companies, but my opinions today are purely of my own, and I'm here on a volunteer basis, not sponsored myself here today. So I think that's important for everyone to know and to hear from my own disclosures.
Thank you so much. And yes, and the sponsors also do not influence the content from BrightFocus's perspective. So let me start here. The medicines Leqembi and Kisunla, they're known scientifically, and we want to just get through this quick, the basics. They're known as monoclonal antibodies. Mary from Minnesota asks, how do these drugs work for Alzheimer's? And Charles from New York says, I'm just interested in what these can do for my wife. So can you
Yes.
tell us how they work?
So a little primer about how they work. To understand that, you have to understand the disease. So what is Alzheimer's disease? It's the clinical changes that we see of memory loss that lead to dementia, which is a functional loss where patients need help. That is due to underlying pathological changes in the brain. What is pathology? It's the accumulation of abnormal proteins, the gunks of protein. The first pathology that accumulates in Alzheimer's disease is amyloid. This leads to tau accumulation in the brain, which then drives cells to not work as well, to be dysfunctional, and then degeneration is called these neurodegenerative diseases, brain degeneration, loss of brain cells, which leads to the clinical changes that we see in our family members, loss of memory, and loss of function, which is dementia. So now you understand the pathology, amyloid and tau, you can understand how these medications work. These are infusion therapies. We give them IV because that's how we have to give antibodies. They go into your bloodstream and they bind to amyloid. And what they do is they then recruit the immune system to remove amyloid from the brain. What they don't do is cure Alzheimer's disease, because Alzheimer's disease is more than just amyloid. So they don't make people better. They also don't stop the disease progression either, but they do slow the progression down. Again, you go back to the pathology because it's two parts, right? There's amyloid and there's tau. And so we're only addressing one part of the pathology. So the goal of treatment is to slow the progression down and to keep patients in an earlier stage longer. As we see the efficacy of these medications, you know, when patients come in an early stage of the disease, the mild cognitive impairment stage, these are people that are doing really well in life. They have some memory problems. They're able to adapt around the memory symptoms, more use of lists and reminders. What people really fear with Alzheimer's disease is the conversion to late stage disease. This is moderate to severe dementia. This is when the disease is overtly obvious in your day to day life. You're requiring daily care. This is when the disease is most impactful. And the goal of these therapies and the efficacy that we see of these therapies is to bend the curve and push out when patients get moderate to severe dementia. we see about a 37% slowing of converting to the next stage of the disease and a 50% slowing in conversion to the late stage of the disease at a year and a half of treatment.
And I get this question a ton. There is so little, like the man who started this and said, I just want something to help my wife. But why is there so little testing being done and so little available to people who are in moderate and later stages? And will that change?
So good point. There's different ways of defining the stages of the disease. There are really sort of six stages, but I think you can even make that even simpler into three stages, which is pre-symptomatic disease, where people develop these pathological changes of amyloid and start to develop tau, but don't have symptoms. Then you have early symptomatic disease, the mild cognitive impairment to mild dementia stage of the disease. Mild dementia means that you're starting to need some help with more complex activities, finances, medications, driving, for example, and then late stage disease where patients need prompting or full assistance with daily care like bathing and dressing, etc. Okay. Now, because Alzheimer's disease is the sequential accumulation of proteins in the brain, amyloid is an early pathology which drives tau. Once patients have significant amount of tau in the brain, the tau becomes self-propagating and it no longer depends on amyloid.
Uh,
Because of this, once patients are in that late stage of the disease, they have too much tau in the brain. Removing amyloid provides no clear clinical benefit. So, this is why we only treat patients in that early symptomatic stage. Right now, we have the data to show that mild cognitive impairment to mild dementia stage is where we see the benefit. But even within that group of mild, early symptomatic Alzheimer's disease, it is very clear that the earlier we intervene, the more likely we are to see benefit. So when I use that term of about a 30% slowing, that group can be further subdivided. If we look at patients that are in those really early stages, mild cognitive impairment with low levels of tau pathology in their brain, we see up to a 60% slowing of cognitive impairment in the donanemab treated group after a year and a half. And at with lecanemab, with low levels of tau in the brain, again, early pathological disease, we see that around 69% of patients at 4 years had no decline in cognition. So the effect, we use the overall effect because that was what was shown in the trial. But even within that, the earlier we intervene, the more likely we are to see significant benefits of these amyloid targeting therapies. Once you're in moderate stage disease, we have to not only we would have to reverse things. And reversal is a much more challenging problem because you have a loss of brain cells and the ability to regenerate brain cells and regrow them back in the same ways that they were before is maybe possible, but that is many, many years down the road. And frankly, we're much better at prevention than we are at reversing. And so this is unfortunately why this most significant advances are in early stage disease.
and this, we're going to talk about this later, also reminds us how important it is to get an early diagnosis if you're concerned.
Absolutely. That is one of the clearest messages that I hope we can convey today is that early diagnosis really matters. And the other thing is that the symptoms of early mild cognitive impairment can be really challenging to figure out. And we now have tools not only to diagnose Alzheimer's disease, but we have the ability to diagnose you with not having Alzheimer's disease. So if you have some mild memory symptoms, some word finding difficulties, you can't remember the name of a street, you can get an evaluation from a neurologist and be told actually you don't have Alzheimer's disease. I think that can be a very liberating diagnosis to give or not diagnosis to have. And so it relieves a lot of anxiety. So the earlier we can test people, we can also tell them they don't have it in addition to having it. If every patient I order an amyloid scan on to look for that pathology of Alzheimer's disease has it, I'm not ordering enough scans.
Understood. So, just quickly before we move on to who's eligible and stuff like that, a lot of questions about can you take this if you're on blood thinners, especially? Can these be combined with other medications, lithium orotate, GLP-1s, Aricept, and Namenda? But a lot, of course, about blood thinners. Can you try to answer all of that in about 3 seconds?
So, with the symptomatic therapies for Alzheimer's disease, I think this is really important to note. So, the symptomatic therapies of Alzheimer's disease, that's donepezil, which is Aricept, rivastigmine, which is Exelon, galantamine, racidine, is the generic name, brand name, Memantine, which is Namenda. What these medications do is they try to optimize brain chemistry. They kind of boost people a little bit. So, if you think of a very like a slow slope downward. That is Alzheimer's disease. What the amyloid therapies do is they bend the slope. They slow the slope. Okay. What the symptomatic therapies do is they boost people, but they don't change the trajectory of the decline over time. These medications were studied in the clinical trial. About half of patients were on one or both of these types of therapies. There's no interaction. They work differently and synergistically. So patients on symptomatic therapies for Alzheimer's disease should stay on those therapies for Alzheimer's disease. Other diabetes medications, GLP-1, hypertension, those medications are very important to also stay on because your vascular health reduces the risk of cognitive decline in the future. There's no clear indication for GLP-1 in Alzheimer's disease. That trial recently didn't show positivity, but there's no reason you need to come off of those medications. And the better you can control other medical illnesses, the better your brain will be. Lithium orotate is an entire conversation in itself. There is no human data that shows that it is efficacious in people. It was a mouse study and a small study in a single lab. I think that needs to be replicated before we recommend giving that to patients. The issue with these amyloid targeting therapies, what we haven't talked about yet, but I think we will, is a side effect called ARIA. So, what happens with ARIA stands for amyloid related imaging abnormalities. To understand what that is it's actually the medication working in some way, but it's working too well. So, as we're stimulating the immune system, we can overstimulate the immune system. And this leads to a swelling that can happen in the brain. That is ARIA E, edema, or ARIA H, which is hemorrhage, bleeding. Typically, these are very small microbleeds or bleeds on the covering of the brain called superficial siderosis. A little microbleed is really clinically meaningless. However, if you have a microbleed while you are on a blood thinner, there's a greater risk of a little bleed becoming a big bleed, and that is a problem. The FDA has not completely excluded, like, it's not an absolute contraindication to give these therapies in patients that are on anticoagulation. But as a field, we are very hesitant to do that because of this risk of a little bleed becoming a bigger bleed, and we don't want to cause harm in patients. So, this is why we try to avoid anticoagulation in use with amyloid targeting therapies. And there are some interventions that you can do to come off of anticoagulation. Again, this is an individualized discussion that needs to happen with your neurologist and a cardiologist, but there are some possibilities that allow patients to get the protection of anticoagulation, but not the risk of anticoagulation, and therefore on to the amyloid targeting therapies, lecanemab and donanemab.
Let's go to who is eligible, what age, stage of disease we talked about, but maybe you can talk about on the cognitive test. So how do you get the diagnosis? Who's eligible? And what are your absolute disqualifiers? What makes you ineligible?
So first of all, and most importantly, it's early symptomatic Alzheimer's disease. That's the mild cognitive impairment to mild dementia stage. So these are patients that have symptoms of cognitive decline, and we can observe that on objective evidence of testing. So this can be a short form cognitive test, something like the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, the MoCA, or the SLUMS, which is the St. Louis version. These are pen and paper tests. Draw a clock, remember some words, maybe come up with some words like number of F words that you can come up with in a minute. These provide us some level of objective assessment of cognition, but shouldn't be overly relied on to stage of the disease. More importantly, I would say, is the impact it's having on someone's life, because there can be caveats to cognitive testing. But everybody should have a history done. What are your symptoms? Some level of objective assessment for their cognition and a functional assessment. So, are you able to adapt around the disease? Do you need help with managing your finances or medications? Once it starts to be prompting for bathing or difficulties getting dressed, reminders to remember to eat, that's really getting into late stage disease. So we're not treating those patients. Okay. So those are the patients. Every patient has to have an MRI. Why? One, we want to make sure that we're not dealing with something else that's not Alzheimer's disease. So ruling out other structural causes, and also assessment of the underlying structure of the brain to see if there's any high risk features that would make patients ineligible. Primarily, if they already have little bleeds in the brain, they would be at high risk for more bleeds occurring, and we wouldn't treat those patients. We also perform, and critical to perform, a confirmation of amyloid status. What does that mean? We want to prove that they have Alzheimer's disease. because not every patient that has memory problems has Alzheimer's disease. And so there's a variety of ways of doing that. The two sort of gold standard ways in clinical practice are an amyloid PET scan. The other way is through spinal fluid analysis, the lumbar puncture, spinal tap. The new emerging way is actually through blood testing. So there's a marker called p-tau 217 that's pretty reliable in predicting whether patients have amyloid deposits in the brain. This is newer. I think there's a little bit of hesitancy to be overly reliant on that as confirmation. I think very helpful in triaging. So figuring out who needs more of that advanced gold standard testing. I think this is where I'm primarily seeing the use of blood-based testing, but that's also evolving over time. So we have to absolutely make sure that they have the disease that we are treating them for. We also perform a test called the ApoE gene test. And this doesn't necessarily mean you can or can't go on therapy, but kind of helps us understand the risk of therapy for that patient. If you have no copies of the E4 gene, you're at the lowest risk of treatment. If you have one copy of the disease, you're kind of at the middle risk. And if you have two copies, you're at the highest risk. So that is very helpful for clinicians and for patients to understand where they are so that they're making the appropriate decision of the risk benefit of treatment.
Let's just quickly talk about how it's administered. It's an infusion. The course generally is 18 months. There's a lot of questions of why is it 18 months instead of 12? If I'm on one and I get through with the 18 months, should I try the other one? Do I wait? How long do the effects remain?
Very good questions. And I will do my best here, but I will be honest, this is an area of uncertainty. So these are new
Ah.
medications, and we are sort of driving the ship forward. So we create access, but also learning a lot as we're doing that. And so we don't have the answers to a lot of these questions. Both medications, as of now, for the initiation of treatment are IV. These are antibodies. You can't take them orally, they have to be injected. I think these will be moving towards some subcutaneous formulations in the future. Area of development. Why 18 months? 18 months was because that was what was done in the clinical trial. Why was 18 months selected in the clinical trial? We wanted enough time to be able to see the efficacy of these medications, but clinical trials are really complex, and running longer clinical trials reduces access, it takes a long time, and are very expensive. 18 months was thought to be a sweet spot for detecting the difference, but not having it too long of a trial. That's why it was 18 months. As far as continuation of treatment, there is a difference in the treatment models here about how to approach the disease. My opinion is that this is the biggest unanswered question in this field right now, which is what is the best options once people are amyloid cleared? I think getting people to amyloid clearance is a very important target and is something that I really try to achieve before I think about maintenance dosing or discontinuing. I want to get that scan to a negative result because every medication that's worked has gotten people to negative results. So that is my personal goal for my patients. But whether we go on to maintenance therapy or discontinue, I think is an unanswered question. I do feel the greatest benefit of these therapies is in that initial clearance of amyloid. There may be some additional benefit to patients in maintaining the effect with maintaining on some level of maintenance therapy and keeping the levels low, but I don't think it's the majority of the effect, and I don't think you have to stay on the therapy to get some effect. But this is an unanswered question.
So you start the infusions. How do you know they're working? I'm gonna get to side effects right after this, I
Mm.
promise. But a lot of people, should people expect to feel better? Should they expect to be remembering more? What if they feel worse? And what if their cognitive tests show that they're declining rapidly when they start the drug?
I'm gonna give an answer that may be a little shocking to people, but you don't actually know if these medications are working.
Wow.
Why do I say that? I'm not trying to throw my hands up, but it is very hard, if not impossible, to judge the efficacy of these medications in an individual person because Alzheimer's disease is a variable disease. We have two medications that are a little bit different, but target the same thing and show a consistent effect. These medications work. We don't need to prove it in an individual patient. Okay. Now, that is easy for me as a scientist and a clinician to say at this very high level. That individual patient wants to know. That is a totally reasonable thing, but I think it's very hard to judge the efficacy of these medications in an individual patient. Now, patients should not expect to feel better.
Mm.
That is an unrealistic expectation because these medications don't improve the disease. They don't stop the progression, they slow the progression down. So the general expectation is that patients will continue to have symptoms. They will continue to decline. I really don't like doing repeat cognitive testing. First of all, patients don't really like doing it. It produces a lot of anxiety in patients. And I don't know what I'm going to do with that data. You lose a point, you gained a point, you lost 5 points. I'm not going to change the course of treatment. What I really like to focus on is function. What is the impact the disease is having on patients? How are they able to adapt around the disease? How can I help them and my team help patients cope with the disease and the symptoms? And I think this is how I judge the efficacy of these medications is the feeling of our patients staying in those early stages for a longer period of time. And now with 2.5 years of clinical experience in treating patients, not in a trial, but in a clinical setting, I do feel that patients, particularly when caught in a very early stage of the disease, are receiving benefit from these therapies because they're staying in those early stages for a longer period of time. Some patients feel a little better. I think that's great, but it's not something that I counsel patients on. That's an unrealistic expectation. We won't know the efficacy of these medications in a patient for years down the road because they stay in those early stages. That's when you would know that they're efficacious.
There's a lot of risk benefit questions. And if I get a bleed, can I you lower the dose? If the bleed goes away, can I start again? Can you give us a 5-minute primer here about ARIA side effect?
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about the efficacy. The goal of treatment is keep patients in an earlier stage for longer, kicking the can down the road for late stage disease. What's the downside? We've talked a little bit about it as far as the infusions inconvenience, but the side effects, I think of as two main side effects. The first is these infusion related reactions. We are infusing an antibody into the bloodstream, and patients can have a reaction to that because you instantly kind of stimulate the immune system. These are typically pretty mild flu-like symptoms, chills, muscle ache, fever. You feel kind of crummy for about 24 hours. These are typically in the first couple of infusions, typically very mild, sometimes can be more significant where patients develop like an anaphylactic reaction,
Yeah.
dropping their blood pressure. This is why we monitor patients in the infusion centers afterwards to make sure that they tolerate the medication. Sometimes we pre-medicate patients with a Tylenol or an antihistamine to kind of reduce the risk of those infusion-related reactions. Typically something very manageable by the infusion centers. The more significant side effect is this ARIA side effect. Amyloid related imaging abnormalities, as I've talked about, it's as the amyloid's being removed, it can overstimulate the immune system, leading to a swelling and edema that happens in the brain or bleeding that happens in the brain. It sounds really scary, but I think it's very important to understand the clinical context for which ARIA occurs. The majority of patients that develop ARIA are asymptomatic, meaning they feel nothing. About 75% of patients that develop it, it is only seen on images and not seen in clinical symptoms. The side effect that most people are really worried about is a permanent problem, like a permanent side effect, a neurologic disability that occurs because of a side effect. And that risk is there, primarily in the risk of a bleed becoming a big bleed. As I said, the majority of bleeds that occur in ARIA are little micro bleeds that are clinically meaningless, but there is a risk of a little bleed becoming a big bleed. And that risk is about 0.5% of treated patients. And these are significant, and these lead to basically a patient having a bleeding stroke, and that can lead to permanent
Mm.
neurologic disability. So if you look at the top line results of about a 15 or 20% risk of developing ARIA, that sounds really scary. You're like, oh my God, I'm going to have a 20% risk of a bleed and a hemorrhage or a swelling that happens in the brain. That is true, but it needs to be put into this appropriate clinical context of the majority of patients feel nothing. If you do develop a symptom, it resolves over time. But there is this serious risk of bleeds, seizures, ICU admission, but that is about a 0.5% or so of a serious symptomatic side effect. The other important aspect is that we can stratify patients' underlying risk for the development of ARIA, and we monitor for ARIA. We can see it on the images. All right. So this gets to understanding why we have to put patients through a lot of MRIs once they're on therapy. ARIA occurs early. Within the first 6 months of treatment, over 90% of the ARIA, if
Mm.
it will occur, will have occurred. This is why we have to monitor patients early in treatment. We want to catch that asymptomatic ARIA before it develops symptoms, make adjustments if we need to the medication, and then go from there. Additional MRIs may be necessary depending on whether patients develop symptoms, but that's why we have to do those monitoring MRIs. It is for safety.
How would you describe the family is sitting in your office, or how do you describe, I should say, and they say risk benefit. What's the risk benefit?
This is an individualized decision. The baseline MRI is very helpful to see if there's any evidence of cerebral amyloid angiopathy, little bleeds that are happening. We exclude those patients that have a significant number, but even patients that have a few of those are at an elevated risk. The other is this ApoE genotype, where it helps us understand the risk benefit. When I talk to patients, we have to just dispel the data. Here is this 30% slowing on average. Here is the risk. I would generally favor for patients that are eligible for treatment, the benefits outweigh the risk. ARIA is a manageable side effect. Again, we have now seen in clinical practice with over 400, nearly 400 patients, 900 patients as the health system, that ARIA is manageable. The observed rates of ARIA in our practice are lower than what was observed in the clinical trial, and this has been replicated in other cohorts around the country and the world, that we're seeing lower rates in clinical practice than what was seen in the clinical trial. Unclear why that is, but exciting to see. So I do think the benefit outweighs the risk. I will say the risk seems pretty static over time. Maybe it does increase as the disease progresses, very modestly, but clearly the efficacy of these medications declines as patients progress through the disease. So when I talk about the risk benefit, I think we really want to focus on the greatest benefit in this early stage patient, the mild cognitive impairment stage patient, where you're adapting around the disease. That is where the benefit is the greatest, and the risk is sort of static. As the disease starts to progress, the risk is still there. And so this is why in late stage disease, we don't treat, because you still have the risk and the benefit is minimal. One thing I would caution though is that we want to treat patients before the disease is really bad. If the disease is really bad and you're feeling like you're grasping at straws because you have this bad disease, that may feel as a patient the time where you want to intervene the most, or as a family you want to intervene the most. I would argue that's probably the least likely to be the efficacious time. There is a bit of a leap of faith that when you're doing really well is when you're going to benefit the most, and that's when we should intervene. So, but recognizing that there is this risk, we don't want to wait for this disease to progress to then intervene. We've missed a window of opportunity.
I'm going to ask a couple quick questions about adherence. If one takes a pause from the Leqembi protocol of several months, and I'm going to read a question from my friend Thomas from Carmel, Indiana. He wants us to discuss why it is important to do the work and stay on the treatments according to their labels. So, can you address adherence a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, these are cumbersome treatments, right? They are influencing people every 2 weeks on lecanemab, every 4 weeks on donanemab. That can interfere with patients' travel plans, and maybe they're a snowbird, they're in different places. I think that first of all, we don't want to start patients that aren't going to be able to be compliant on therapy. Because if we start people, they do it for a few months, we've exposed them to a lot of risk, they're not going to get the benefit. So this is where the counseling of understanding what you're signing up for is really important. Now, if you need to skip an infusion because you have a big retirement plan trip and you want to skip one treatment, I don't think that's a big deal. Now, if you're going to skip every other treatment,
That's
that's
a big deal.
probably a bigger deal, because there is evidence to show that the sooner we get people to amyloid clearance, the greater the efficacy. So, one infusion here or there a year is not a big deal, but you don't want to extend this initial course of treatment over 3 or 4 years. We don't know that it won't impact the disease, but that would probably not be ideal.
This is really fantastic. I just have to thank you. Really wanted to get to coverage and access because there are a lot of questions about it.
Top line there is that generally the testing, amyloid PET, MRIs are covered, particularly fee for service. Medicare Advantage can be more challenging, and commercial plans for the patients that are under the age of 65 also can be more challenging, require a lot of authorizations, etc. It's very individualized, but generally we are getting coverage. Generally, these are not costing a lot out of pocket, but there's exceptions to that as well.
And of course, it's hard also to find your doctor or your healthcare system that prescribes these.
I want the patients and the families to push their physicians, push their neurologists. This is incredibly important. We must advocate for this disease and we must advocate for our family members. By you as consumers pushing the healthcare system, we will advance this disease. We at Sutter Health are really attuned to this, and a lot of patients are motivated. I'm biased here clearly, but the brain is the most fundamentally human organ, and it what makes us who we are. And why patients fear Alzheimer's disease is the loss of that identity and who we are. And if we can preserve that for longer, we're making great impact on families and patients' lives. There is a lack of understanding of this disease, particularly early stage disease, by patients and doctors throughout the world, in the United States and community. Through advocacy, doctors will rise to the occasion, patients will rise to the occasion. I think we are at a turning point for this disease, just like we were at cancer 50 years ago, sharing diagnosis, talking about this disease, helping each other through that. Before, cancer was a word that no one would talk about in the 60s and 70s, before my time. But this is Alzheimer's disease now. And I think we will all do better when we're able to talk about this disease and push our physicians and health systems towards taking this seriously.
I love that you said that. Thank you for saying that. And Dean Brenner had written in the chat much earlier, what do you think is the most important step that could be taken to spur far more early diagnosis and to get more people on these medications?
I think patients can share their diagnosis. I know there's a lot of hesitancy around that, and you don't want to be the patient that falls on the sword first, but many of your colleagues and friends are feeling similar symptoms. It may be Alzheimer's disease, it may be not. I think it's important to know because we can intervene at this point. So, sharing your journey, sharing your diagnosis, knowing, dispelling the myth that Alzheimer's disease is someone that is sitting in a corner completely inactive in their life, but you can have mild cognitive impairment, a lot of quality, enjoyable life with this very early stage of disease.
What Dr. Moughamian just said does tell you you are not alone, and you are not alone with this disease. And we have to try to share our diagnoses, our family tragedies, the caregiver problems that we have for each other because we're all going through this, so many of us. And we want you to know, get as much information as you can and know that how many people are dedicated to working on these problems.
This is the greatest thing about this. Before we used to just talk about Alzheimer's disease as the scientific problem, but now we're able to talk about it as a clinical problem and how we're going to intervene and improve patients' lives. So this is so exciting because we're shifting from this academic disease to a disease that is modifiable and treatable in clinics like my own and around the country.
Hopefully, this program has clarified some questions about Leqembi and Kisunla, but you can reach out directly to the companies that make them if you still have more questions. For Leqembi, go to leqembi.com, Leqembi, and the patient support phone for that is 1-833-453-7362 or 1-833-4-Leqembi. For Kisunla, go to kisunla.lilly.com. That's Lily with two L's. And their patient support phone is 1-800-545-5979 or 1-800-LILY-RX. You've been listening to Let's Talk Alzheimer's from BrightFocus Foundation's Alzheimer's Disease Research Program. And I want to thank Dr. Armen Moughamian for taking the time to share his practical insights into what patients and families should know about these new Alzheimer's treatments. One of the clearest takeaways from this conversation is that early diagnosis matters. As new treatments emerge, identifying Alzheimer's disease in its earliest stages can offer patients more options and more time. If you found this episode helpful, please subscribe, share it with others, and leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Conversations like these help more families access reliable information and feel less alone in navigating Alzheimer's disease. And life is so short. Tell everyone you love how much you love them, give them a hug, and hold them close to you. Have a great day and be well.
Thanks for listening to Let's Talk Alzheimer's. If this episode helped you better understand Alzheimer's disease, please hit like and subscribe to stay informed. And if this podcast would be helpful to people you know, please share it with them. For trusted information on Alzheimer's and the latest research towards a cure, visit brightfocus.org. Get the latest information on new medications, lifestyle changes, active clinical trials, and breakthrough technologies. Thank you to our sponsors, Lilly, Biogen, Eisai, and Genentech, for making this program possible. And thank you so much for spending this time with us.
Resonate.